In the heart of the Caribbean, on an island known for its warmth and beauty, there once lived a man whose name would strike fear into an entire nation. His story began in poverty and ended in flames. For years, his face haunted police stations, his legend whispered through the cane fields, his crimes printed across every front page from San Juan to New York. Some called him a monster, others a symbol of defiance against a world that had given him nothing. This is not just the story of a criminal, it's the story of a country caught between faith and fear, between justice and vengeance, between myth and memory. The man's name was Antonio Correa Cotto, and to this day, his shadow still lingers over Puerto Rico. Let's journey back to mid-20th century Puerto Rico, in the quiet neighborhood of Machuelo Abajo. Let's journey back to the mid-20th century, to the southern coast of Puerto Rico, in the humble yet vibrant town of Ponce. Just beyond the city's busy streets lay Machuelo Abajo, a quiet, working-class neighborhood surrounded by lush hills and the scent of sugarcane, tobacco, and freshly brewed coffee. This is where the story of one of Puerto Rico's most infamous men began, Antonio Correa Cotto. Antonio was born in June 1918 into a large and struggling family. His parents, Rodolfo Correa Martinez and Aniceta Cotto Garcia, worked tirelessly to provide for their 9 children. Like many Puerto Rican families of that era, they lived simply, surviving on modest wages, guided by faith and bound together by the strength of family. Their small wooden home, painted in bright island colors, stood as a quiet reflection of hope amid hardship. Ponce itself was a city of contrasts. While downtown bustled with theaters, cafes, and the refined charm of colonial architecture, the outskirts told a different story, one of poverty, labor, and perseverance. The city's air carried both the sweet aroma of roasted coffee beans and the distant hum of sugar mills that powered its economy. From a young age, Antonio watched the divide between the rich and the poor with growing curiosity. He would often wander the streets of Ponce, gazing at the grand plazas, the polished cars, and the well-dressed men who seemed to live in a different world. Somewhere inside, a quiet desire began to grow, a longing to rise above his circumstances and claim a place among those who lived with such ease and confidence. What no one could have imagined then was that this restless, wide-eyed boy from Machuelo Abajo would one day become one of the most feared and mythologized figures in Puerto Rican history. By the early 20th century, Puerto Rico was undergoing rapid change. After becoming a U.S. territory in 1898, the island saw a wave of American influence reshape its institutions, including its schools. By 1900, education had been made free and compulsory, and by the time young Antonio Correa Cotto entered the classroom, a bilingual system was already in place, teaching children in both English and Spanish. For many, this new education system symbolized opportunity. But for families like Antonio's, survival came first. Growing up in poverty in Machuelo Abajo, attending school every day wasn't always possible. Antonio's teachers often described him as restless and easily distracted, a boy who struggled to stay still when the world outside seemed far more interesting than the lessons within those walls. Before long, he left school altogether, barely learning the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. His parents, aware of their growing financial strain, found him work as an apprentice to a local carpenter. It was honest labor, cutting wood, hammering nails, and sweeping up sawdust, but it also meant his childhood ended early. Each small paycheck Antonio brought home helped feed his brothers and sisters, easing the family's burden, at least for a while. Yet, behind that sense of duty was a young man who longed for more. More freedom, more money, and perhaps something he couldn't yet define. As Antonio grew older, the weight of responsibility only deepened. By his late teens, he was taking on whatever work he could find, hauling lumber, repairing fences, and laboring long days under the burning sun in the sugarcane fields of southern Puerto Rico. These were grueling jobs, the kind that left a man's hands calloused and his spirit worn. During the 1930s and 1940s, Puerto Rico's economy was dominated by large sugar companies, many owned by American corporations. Wages were painfully low, and opportunities for advancement were nearly non-existent. For young men like Antonio, dreams of a better life often collided with harsh reality. Every week, he handed most of his pay to his parents, doing his part to support the family. But no matter how hard he worked, there was never enough. Not enough money, not enough opportunity, not enough hope. His ambitions began to outgrow the narrow world around him. That quiet frustration slowly turned into anger, and then into defiance. Tired of living hand to mouth, Antonio started seeking faster, easier ways to make money. What began as small acts of petty theft soon escalated into bolder crimes. The young man who once swung a hammer in the sugar mills now carried a knife through the streets of Ponce. At first, his record was minor. A small offense led to 2 months in jail and a $15 fine. Nothing remarkable, at least on paper. But that short time behind bars only hardened him. Instead of discouraging his behavior, it gave him a taste of notoriety. By 1942, his crimes had escalated. He was involved in a violent assault that left one man seriously injured. Still, no formal charges were filed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of corruption. A year later, in October 1943, he was arrested again and briefly imprisoned. But each encounter with the police only fueled his confidence. The system, he realized, couldn't stop him. To Antonio, crime was no longer just a way to survive, it was becoming a way to live. And through it all, he carried himself with a striking, almost cinematic flair. Neighbors often saw him dressed sharply, polished shoes, crisp shirts, and a confident stride that commanded attention. A thin scar cut across his face, and his tattoos, etched along his arms and chest, spoke of defiance and danger. Yet to many women in Ponce, he was strangely captivating, a blend of charm, mystery, and menace. The 1940s were changing Puerto Rico. As the island absorbed more of America's culture, young people idolized Hollywood gangsters and famous outlaws. Names like Al Capone and John Dillinger echoed in popular stories and films. And in Antonio Correa Cotto, the youth of Ponce found their very own version of that rebellion, a man who stood against the system, whether out of pride, anger, or sheer desperation. Soon his name spread through the island's neighborhoods, whispered in bars, echoed in police stations, and printed in the back pages of local papers. To some, he was a dangerous criminal, to others, a folk anti-hero. But to everyone, one thing was certain. Antonio Correa Cotto had arrived. By the mid-1940s, Antonio Correa Cotto's reputation was well known across Ponce. Part danger, part allure. He was bold, unpredictable, and strangely magnetic. Many women were drawn to him, though few truly understood the storm that lived beneath his calm exterior. Among those captivated by his charm was Rosa Maria, a gentle and kind-hearted widow who had already endured her share of hardship. She was known in her community for her warmth, her modest grace, and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. To her, Antonio seemed different, a man both troubled and tender, someone who needed love more than judgment. In September of 1947, the two were married in Ponce, a ceremony that stirred curiosity and gossip in equal measure. Some neighbors admired the match, the beautiful widow and the infamous outlaw. Others whispered warnings, convinced that Rosa Maria had stepped into the path of a man whose temper could burn as fiercely as his charm. For a brief moment, it appeared that Antonio might change, that marriage could tame the restless energy that had long driven him toward trouble. But beneath the surface, that darkness still flickered. His life of crime had already taken root too deeply, and peace, for a man like Antonio Correa Cotto, would never last. It was a warm Thursday evening, January 25, 1950, when darkness fell over the quiet neighborhood of Villa Olga, part of the Machuelo Abajo district in Ponce, Puerto Rico. What began as an ordinary night would soon turn into one of the most horrifying crimes the city had ever witnessed. That evening, Antonio Correa Cotto made his way through the narrow, dimly lit streets until he reached the modest home of a 69-year-old man, a resident known in the neighborhood for his calm and simple life. No one truly knows what drove Antonio there, whether rage, desperation, or pure impulse. But once inside, his fury exploded. He attacked the elderly man without mercy, stabbing him repeatedly before turning on the man's terrified wife. The chaos didn't end there. Antonio then went after the 3 other people inside the house, family members who had been helplessly watching the scene unfold. When police finally arrived, they were met with carnage beyond imagination. 2 people were dead, their lives brutally cut short, while 3 others lay severely wounded, bleeding across the floor. The small wooden home that once echoed with the quiet sounds of family life was now a scene of horror and disbelief. As the officers tried to enter, Antonio refused to surrender. In one final act of defiance, he drew a pistol and opened fire, wounding a police officer before slipping back into the night. His rampage had left the community in shock, and the island trembling with fear. That night, Antonio Correa Cotto was no longer just a petty criminal or a local outlaw. He had crossed a line that would forever brand him as Puerto Rico's most feared man. In the days following the Villa Olga massacre, fear slowly gave way to relief. After an intense island-wide search, Antonio Correa Cotto was finally captured. His arrest brought an uneasy calm to Ponce, a city still haunted by the bloodshed he had left behind. For the first time in months, people could breathe again. Antonio's capture was front-page news. His photograph appeared in nearly every newspaper in Puerto Rico, from El Imparcial and El Mundo to El Dia. The headlines described him as the nation's most dangerous man, a figure whose crimes had shocked the island. Word of his arrest even reached neighboring islands like the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Cuba, spreading his infamy far beyond Puerto Rico's shores. Awaiting trial, Antonio was held in the Ponce Penitentiary, his freedom abruptly stripped away. The courtroom that later tried him was packed, spectators, journalists, and law officers all wanting to see the man who had terrorized their communities. Presiding over the case were judges Pedro Muniz and Lorenzo Lira, 2 men who knew the verdict was already inevitable. When the proceedings began, there was little doubt about the outcome. The evidence was overwhelming, and Antonio himself seemed indifferent. In the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in the state penitentiary, a punishment meant to ensure he would never again walk free. He was just 32 years old. Yet even behind bars, Antonio refused to show remorse. To those who met him, he appeared calm, almost pious. He regularly attended confession, clutching a rosary as if seeking redemption. But that image of faith was only surface deep. Within prison walls, he boasted about his crimes and vowed revenge on those who had brought him down, even threatening judges Muniz and Lira by name. For the people of Puerto Rico, his defiance was chilling. The monster they thought was finally caged still radiated menace from within his cell. But fate had other plans. Just 7 months after his conviction, on the morning of October 28, 1950, chaos erupted inside the Ponce District Penitentiary. What began as a disturbance quickly spiraled into one of the most daring prison breaks in Puerto Rican history. No one knew exactly who had masterminded it. Some said it was a spontaneous act of desperation. Others whispered that Antonio Correa Cotto, ever the opportunist, played a silent role in its planning. Whatever the truth, what followed was pure mayhem. A small group of inmates set the plan in motion, deliberately provoking guards and spreading confusion throughout the cell blocks. Within minutes, shouts echoed through the corridors, and flames began to rise. The riot grew uncontrollable. Prisoners overpowered several guards, forcing open gates and seizing keys. In a matter of moments, the mob had reached the armory, where they armed themselves with rifles, revolvers, and ammunition. Gunfire filled the air. The penitentiary, once a place of order and confinement, had turned into a battlefield. By the time reinforcements arrived, 2 prison guards were dead, and several others were seriously injured. The smoke cleared to reveal a devastating reality. 68 inmates out of 111 had escaped, vanishing into the countryside under the cover of chaos. Among the fugitives were some of Puerto Rico's most violent offenders. And at the top of that list was a name every citizen already knew: Antonio Correa Cotto. The island awoke to the terrifying news the next morning. Newspapers called it the most brazen escape Puerto Rico had ever seen. Police forces mobilized and fear once again gripped the nation. For the people of Ponce, it felt as though the nightmare had returned. The prison break sent shockwaves across Puerto Rico. The Department of Justice and the insular police were thrown into chaos, scrambling to regain control. In an instant, the island had become a hunting ground for dozens of escaped convicts, men hardened by violence and desperation. But among them, one name inspired the most fear of all: Antonio Correa Cotto. Authorities knew they had to act fast. Under the leadership of Police Chief Salvador Roig, law enforcement launched one of the largest manhunts in Puerto Rican history. Patrols were deployed across the island, from the coastal plains of Ponce to the rugged mountains of the interior. Checkpoints were set up, and armed officers swept through cane fields and forests in search of the fugitive who had once again vanished into the shadows. The news spread quickly, carried by radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines. Panic began to grip the public. People locked their doors before sundown, whispering rumors that Antonio had been spotted near their town. Some farmers slept with rifles by their beds, terrified that the escaped prisoners might appear at their doorsteps. Chief Roig issued firm orders to the public: do not approach the fugitives, report any sighting, cooperate with the police at all costs. His message was clear: the authorities would stop at nothing to bring them in, dead or alive. Despite the massive effort, months passed with no success. Antonio seemed to move like a ghost, always one step ahead of the law. Then, on February 25, 1951, he resurfaced, not in hiding but in full violence. Returning to Ponce, he attacked his own cousin, Oscar Correa Cotto, nearly killing him. The assault sent a chilling message: Antonio was no longer just evading capture, he was taunting the police. Only 2 days later, he struck again. This time, he broke into the home of an elderly couple, brutally attacked them, and set their house on fire before disappearing into the night. By now, the city of Ponce was paralyzed with fear. People spoke his name only in whispers. Despite the police presence, Antonio moved unseen, leaving behind nothing but blood and smoke. He was no longer just a fugitive. He had become a symbol of terror. After his violent escape from prison, Antonio Correa Cotto became the most wanted man in Puerto Rico. Police across the island carried his description in their pockets: 5 foot 5 inches tall, about 135 pounds, slightly curly black hair, a small mustache, scars on his forehead, above his right eyebrow, and across his lips. When newspapers printed his wanted poster, they added a chilling detail: that his cold, piercing eyes could unnerve anyone who looked at him. For months, Antonio seemed to vanish completely. Then, in the early hours of May 10, 1952, he resurfaced, and with him came another wave of horror. In the same Villa Olga neighborhood of Ponce where his earlier rampage had begun, Antonio struck again. What followed was another act of pure brutality. Several people were attacked, and among the victims were 2 women, Julia Matei and Senora Alvarado, both of them pregnant. By dawn, the community was shattered. The tragedy left children without parents and families torn apart. Fear turned into outrage. Residents who once whispered his name in terror now openly demanded justice. This time, the entire island rallied. Private citizens, local associations, and even government departments contributed to reward funds for his capture. Posters offering cash rewards, dead or alive, appeared in every town square. Under the leadership of Justice Secretary Salvador Viñals, the investigation intensified. Police combed through rural villages and mountain hideouts, desperate to end the nightmare once and for all. By now, Correa Cotto's infamy had spread far beyond Ponce. His story dominated headlines from San Juan to Santiago de Cuba, and rumors traveled faster than truth. Some claimed he had fled the island entirely, to New York, Chicago, or even as far as Asia. Others believed he was hiding in plain sight, protected by sympathizers who admired his defiance of the system. The press only added fuel to the fire. Each supposed sighting became front-page news. Each whisper of his whereabouts turned him further into legend, half man, half myth. He was now the ghost of Puerto Rico, a figure who could appear anywhere, strike at will, and vanish into thin air. In their desperation, the police detained more than 70 people, friends, relatives, anyone suspected of harboring him. But nothing led to his capture. By early 1952, frustration within the Puerto Rican police had reached its breaking point. Despite the island's modest size, barely 100 miles long and 35 miles wide, Antonio Correa Cotto had managed to vanish completely. Every lead led to another dead end. Every rumor faded into silence. The dense tropical forests, overgrown sugarcane fields, and winding mountain roads provided perfect cover for a man who knew how to disappear. Determined to end the manhunt once and for all, officials took an unprecedented step. They requested assistance from the United States, hoping fresh expertise might succeed where local efforts had failed. Soon, 4 police officers from Florida arrived in Puerto Rico, bringing with them a team of trained bloodhounds flown in from Miami, dogs renowned for their sharp instincts and tracking precision. The plan was simple but desperate. Unleash the hounds in the Ponce region, where Antonio was believed to be hiding. Officers scoured the thick brush, following every scent and every footprint, searching through fields scorched by the Caribbean sun. Meanwhile, the drama had captured the attention of the press far beyond Puerto Rico. The Miami Herald, the Tampa Tribune, and other U.S. newspapers began publishing updates on what they called the Caribbean's greatest manhunt. Reporters described the island's growing fear and its relentless determination to bring the fugitive to justice. Every day, more police poured into the countryside, armed and exhausted, closing in on what they hoped would be the end of a 2-year nightmare. After nearly 2 years on the run, the hunt for Antonio Correa Cotto was finally nearing its end. On the morning of May 16, 1952, authorities received a crucial tip. Antonio had been seen hiding at a farm near Hacienda Barrancas, just outside Ponce, Puerto Rico. It was the break the police had been waiting for. Within hours, dozens of armed officers surrounded the property, sealing off every road and path leading in or out. Through a loudspeaker, officers called on Antonio to surrender peacefully. But true to his nature, he refused. For him, capture was never an option. As the police advanced, Antonio fired at them, using the dense fields of sugarcane as his cover. His defiance sparked a tense standoff that stretched into the afternoon. When negotiations failed, Captain Luis Perez, the commanding officer on the scene, made a desperate decision. He ordered his men to set fire to the surrounding fields, hoping the spreading flames would flush the fugitive out of hiding. The fire roared through the tall cane stalks, sending waves of smoke and heat into the sky. Cornered and surrounded by flames, Antonio refused to yield. In one final act of defiance, he burst from the burning fields, a pistol in one hand and a machete in the other, shouting at the officers who encircled him. For a brief, haunting moment, time seemed to stop. Then, at Captain Perez's command, the officers opened fire. When the smoke cleared, Puerto Rico's most wanted man lay dead, his reign of terror finally over. The chase that had terrified the island for more than a year had come to a violent, fiery end. News of Antonio's death spread across Puerto Rico like wildfire. The country awoke to headlines that captured every gruesome detail. Newspapers such as El Mundo and El Imparcial printed vivid front-page accounts of the shootout, accompanied by striking photographs of the aftermath. For many, it was proof that the long nightmare was finally over. Yet even in death, Antonio's presence refused to fade. His body was taken to Ponce's civil cemetery, where a quiet burial was held under heavy police watch. Despite the simple ceremony, hundreds of curious onlookers gathered to witness the moment. Some came out of morbid fascination, others to confirm that the island's most feared man was truly gone. Not everyone celebrated his death. A few voices, particularly those who believed in due process, lamented that Antonio had never faced justice in a courtroom. They argued that a public trial might have revealed more about his motives, his psyche, and the failures of the system that had shaped him. Instead, his life ended in the same violence that had defined it. But for the public, Antonio had already become something larger than life. His story transcended crime reports and entered Puerto Rican folklore. Within months, his name began to appear in songs, plays, and neighborhood tales. One of the first musical tributes came from the Rudy Hawk Orchestra, whose salsa hit El de Ponce turned his legend into rhythm. A haunting, upbeat song that told the tale of the man who defied the law and met a fiery end. In the years that followed, filmmakers and storytellers would revisit his life again and again, each version blending fact and myth, painting him alternately as a monster, a rebel, and a tragic figure shaped by circumstance. Decades later, Puerto Rican filmmaker Braulio Lopez brought Antonio's story to the big screen. His film, showcased at the New York Film Festival, reintroduced Correa Cotto to a new generation, not as a hero but as a symbol of how violence and poverty can twist human ambition beyond recognition. Time has not erased Antonio Correa Cotto's name. In Puerto Rican history, he remains both a warning and a fascination. A man who embodied the thin line between desperation and destruction. In the end, it wasn't the bullets that made Antonio Correa Cotto immortal. It was the fear he left behind. The boy from Machuelo Abajo, born in hunger, raised in hardship, had become a man whose name outlived him. His story was retold in songs, in whispers, in film reels that blurred truth and legend until no one could tell them apart. Some say he was evil. Others say he was a creation of the world around him, a reflection of poverty, injustice, and a system that never gave him a way out. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere between them, between the sinner and the symbol, between the man and the myth. Decades have passed, yet his ghost still walks through Puerto Rico's history, a reminder of how desperation can twist into violence, and how legends are born not from greatness, but from fear. This is the story of Antonio Correa Cotto, not just the tale of a killer, but of an island that never forgot him.